Journey Outside by Mary Q. Steele. This is Chapter 9. We are on to Chapter 9 of the book called Journey Outside by Mary Q. Steele. So he got rescued and he has food and he's in a warm cave. And we're on to Chapter 9 to find out how long he'll stay with Wingo or what might happen with Wingo. After Dilar could not remember how long he stayed with Wingo. The days went by, each one very like the other, warm and bright, filled with the good smells of baking and cooking, and the sounds of Wingo talking and talking and talking. Every day he cooked their meals and made his basket loads of cakes and tended his stores. Dilar helped and soon learned to do it all himself by watching. But Wingo would only let him do the simplest things, stir the soup occasionally, or fetch things from the storerooms or sweep the floors. "It takes clever hands to feed the fire for baking," he'd say, or "You might get burned," or No, you have to know just how long to beat in the eggs for good cakes, and the batter's heavy. It might strain your arm to beat it," or "Let me lift that bag. A young fellow like you hasn't the strength." Dilar might have been bored with so little to do, except that Wingo talked so much, told so many stories, sang so many songs. He knew about every bag of meal and every bowl of honey in his pantries, and could tell a tale about each one. Dilar was the best of listeners, for almost everything was new to him, a boy of the raft people. And besides, he kept hoping to learn more about Wingo. By listening to him, to discover whether this really was a wise man who knew all the answers to all the questions. Not that Wingo ever let him ask a question or listen to him when he said anything. "I am one of the raft people," Dilar said carefully one day as Wingo was putting a pan full of cakes into the oven. "Are you now?" answered Wingo. "Did I tell about the time I bought a load of grapes up the mountain on a donkey? I had to spend the night on the mountainside, and in the night the donkey ate all the grapes. Every one." He laughed till tears came to his eyes. "Once I went to trade some meal for oil with a man who lived on a river," he began another day, and Dilar interrupted quickly. "I am one of the raft people, and I used to live on a river. I spent my whole life on a raft." "Oh, I suppose it was more of a lake than a river," said Wingo vaguely. "A good big lake with oil nut trees growing all around. He had a kind of mill to press the oil out of the nuts, and it ran down a little stone trough into a stone vat, the best and clearest oil I ever saw. I've got some now in cold rooms." "Don't you want to hear about where I came from?" cried Dilar once impatiently, and Wingo said in surprise, "Why, certainly I do. I'm listening. Not that it makes any difference where you came from. You are here, and that's what matters. It is right now that is important, I always say. And it is, you know. Hand me that pan, and we'll have these cakes in the oven in no time." And he began to stir and beat the dough with such a clatter that Dilar could only fall silent and watch. 3 days after Dilar's arrival, it began to snow heavily. The snow fell and fell, piling up in great soft drifts that delighted Dilar's eyes, heaping up along the branches of the trees, covering the rocks till the world stretched away from the cave door, smoothly white, shadowed and hollowed with greens and blues and lavenders that made Dilar's heart ache for reasons he could not name. Wingo was busier than ever. His baking was frantic. When they went out to carry the basket loads of cakes into the woods, he showed Dilar how to walk in the snow, to follow the sheltered side of the evergreens and the paths made by the larger animals. For a long way they went through an arched passage where branches grew close and the snow caught among them to make sort of roofs over the space between the trees. Dilar did not like walking in this white, silent, low-ceilinged tunnel. It made him feel shut away and unhappy. He could not go back to the rafts ever, he thought suddenly. He would never learn to live in so narrow and confined a place. Wingo hurried through the drifts and along the paths. He huffed and puffed and panted. Sweat sprang up on his forehead as they struggled through the snow. I tried to get to the feeding places before the cakes get cold, he gasped out to Dilar. Oh, my poor little creatures. They need warm food in weather like this. Oh, their poor little feet in the snow. Let me carry the basket, pleaded Dilar. It is easier for me. I am strong. Let me carry the basket. No, no, answered Wingo breathlessly. It's too heavy. Anyway, all I can do for my little friends is to bring them their warm cakes. So they floundered on, Dilar hopping ahead, for by this time he knew the route well. It was useless trying to make the way easier for Wingo, however, for Dilar was only half his weight. Icy crust that merely bent and squeaked under Dillar's feet gave way entirely under the big man's step and made his going even harder than before. After the snowfall, the cold was bitterer than ever. The sun came out and made the world a blaze of blue-white light, and the air sparkled with the ice crystals floating in the sunbeams. Even the air is frozen, Dilar thought. Cold was nothing like what he had imagined. It did not, like heat, press against you, hover around you. Instead, it pulled and tore at you with narrow, pinching fingers. He wondered what other strange things there were in the world. Was there any way to be besides cold and hot? And what could those other ways be? Would he ever find out? Should he leave here to find out? Or should he stay with Wingo? Perhaps when the snow went away, Wingo would have time to stop and think a minute and answer a question or two. He did not believe anyway that he wanted to leave now in this cold. Sometimes he wondered about Dorna and Norna and Borba and the others, hungry, shivering in their ill-heated houses. He told himself that Dorna was right and that cold was a terrible thing, and yet it was beautiful. He could not help admiring the snow, the sun twinkling on the ice-bent trees, the strange echoless sound in the wrapped and muffled world, the flash of a bird among the immaculate tree branches, and when twilight swept over the mountaintop, it made tears come to his eyes. It was so lovely and sad. Since the snow, there were tigers in the warm outer caves almost every time Dilar and Wingo went out. Wingo shouted and beat on the walls with the metal bar, and they always got up lazily and drifted outside. How handsome and bright they were in the snow! When the crust was soft and they broke through and thrashed about in the cold white stuff, their movements were so lithe and their colors so brilliant that sometimes Dilar ran to the front of the cave to watch them out of sight. Be careful, warned Wingo. They'll chew you into splinters and mud. They're treacherous. But to Dilar, they did not seem anxious even to turn back and look at him. How sleek they were. They looked lazy and content, as though all they asked for was a warm place to lie down and stretch. More snow fell and more. Drifts piled upon drifts until in some places the trees were half buried. Every morning there was a new skin of snow over yesterday's fall. It almost hid things that worried Dilar a great deal, but which Wingo seemed not to notice. Things that Dilar termed to himself the bloody places. Spots in the snow where some creature had died a violent death, blood on the broken crust, sad little heaps of bone and fur or feathers. Dilar never mentioned them to Wingo, for he knew the big man must mourn the death of each of his small friends, each of the little beasts he worked so hard to care for every day. How long does the winter last here on the mountains? Dilar asked one morning, as he stood hugging himself to keep out the cold, waiting for Wingo to empty his basket. A long time, said Wingo with a chuckle. And when it is done, the work begins. Oh, you and I will be busy indeed, my young friend. As soon as the bees swarm in the valley and the oil nuts are thoroughly warmed, we have to start our work. We have to begin replenishing our stores. You and I, thought Dilar, we have to begin? Did he really want to stay here with Wingo after the cold weather? Was Wingo truly going to be willing to listen to what he had to say and tell him what to do? If he was going to be busier than ever, would he even have a minute to stop and listen to Dilar? Later, he wandered away from Wingo and climbed through the drifted snow, pondering. He had to stay here until the snow stopped and the weather warmed, he knew, but longer than that? His head was almost on a level with the first branches of a tall tree. When the snow melted, those branches would be far out of his reach. He grabbed one suddenly and swung himself up and climbed quickly to a point where he could look down on Wingo and the flocks of birds. After a minute, he realized he was not the only one watching. In the needled evergreen tree next to him, another pair of eyes was fastened on the feeding birds with the eager, unwavering gaze of the hunter. Dilar drew in his breath, watching the proud head with its fierce, dark sideburns and strong, tearing beak. It would be useless, he knew, to try to warn the smaller birds or to frighten the hawk away. Sooner or later, while the birds were bemused with warm crumbs, those sharp talons would find their mark. Slowly, Dilar descended his tree and slid and slithered down the snowbanks to the path that he and Wingo had trod to the feeding place. When he got to that spot, Wingo had emptied the basket and stood holding the last piece of cake in his hand, while a little green bird sat on his thumb and pecked contentedly as Wingo spoke to it softly. "Now where have you been?" cried Wingo cheerfully. "We must hurry. There'll be storms again this afternoon. We won't be able to go out. We'll have to sit by the fire, and I'll make a special plum and honey cake, and I'll tell you a tale about how I caught the great long-legged blue birds of the lake and made him work for me." He chuckled at the thought and then added hastily, "I didn't make him work very hard, of course." It was a pleasant prospect, Dilar thought, to sit warm and snug and eating the fragrant cake while Wingo talked and talked. But was this how he wanted to spend his life, forever and ever? Was this how he was going to find the answers to his questions? They walked through the snow, and Dilar looked back to see the hawk crouched in the top of the tree, all its body tense and aimed like an arrow drawn back in a bowstring. "Look," he said to Wingo, "look at the hawk in the top of the tree." Wingo turned his head. "Where?" he asked. "There in the top of the evergreen tree," Dilar pointed. Wingo stared and then shook his head. "Your eyes are playing tricks on you," he said at last. "There aren't any hawks on this mountain." And he hurried on. You think he's just not wanting to see it? Let's read to find out. Dilar followed, but he had new questions to fret over now. Was Wingo really a man of kindliness and wisdom? Or was it stupid and cruel to lure birds and animals to places where they were easy victims? No wonder the tigers were so sleek and slow to rouse, with nothing to do but wait for Wingo to provide dinner for them as he provided it for the birds. Thinking about it made Dilar's flesh creep a little. Didn't Wingo know what happened? Didn't he see the bloody places in the snow? What was the matter with his eyes that kept him from seeing the hawk? The snowstorms did come before they could fill the basket and carry it outside once more. Wingo was distressed, but soon busied himself making the plum and honey cake and telling Dilar the story he had promised. Dilar sat gazing into the fire, hardly hearing the words. No, he told himself, Wingo could not be a wise man. He did not answer questions, only filled Dilar's mind with new and different ones. "Wingo," he said suddenly, "I must leave this place. I must travel on from here." There was a moment's astonished silence. And then the man cried, "How can you say such a thing? You don't mean what you say. No, you wouldn't leave me. Who would help carry the cakes? Who would help me bake? Who would keep me company?" His voice rose to a loud and desperate note. Dilar smiled a little uneasily. "I don't help you, Wingo," he said. "You could get along without me just as you did before I came. And for company, you've always got the birds and the animals. They are your friends and always will be." A crafty, almost mean look stole over Wingo's face. "Anyway," he said, "you can't leave now. In the snow and the cold, how would you keep warm and fed if you left here? You must wait till warmer days anyway." And he thrust a great smoking, buttery piece of the cake at Dilar and began once more to tell his story. But Dilar could hardly swallow a mouthful. Suddenly he was frightened. Like the birds and the little animals, had Wingo's cakes and warm fires lured him into some kind of trap where something waited to fall on him and tear him to bits? Was he to be a victim too? In the next few days, Wingo was as jolly as ever. Still, he seemed to Dilar to keep a watchful eye on him all the time. He let Dilar do more of the basket carrying and cake crumbling and throwing so that the boy would not have the opportunity to wander off. He worked harder than ever at telling stories and singing songs. He baked more cakes and made sweetmeats, and every now and then he would pat Diller's shoulder and tell him what a help he was and how lonely it had been on the mountaintop before he came. Diller always remembered to thank Wingo for saving his life and say how grateful he was for a place to stay during the cold weather. Yet the cold weather was going. Snow fell, but the hard crust began to disappear. Wading through the slushy wet stuff was uncomfortable, and the places on Diller's feet where the frost had bitten him so many weeks ago burned and stung. He and Wingo hurried back to the fire after taking each load of cakes, and sometimes Diller's clothes were still damp and clammy. By the time the next basketful was ready, Wingo was right. He must certainly wait for warmer weather. Still, he told himself he could lay plans. Even under Wingo's constant surveillance, he could lay plans and make ready to go. He knew which way he should travel, and as they walked in that direction, he often noted landmarks and lines of trees and shelters against rocks where the going would be the easiest and quickest. Once he found the edge of the mountain, the way down into the valley would be simple. He had climbed up, and doubtless he could climb down. He began to long to go, to be more eager than he had ever been before to leave the blazing hearth and Wingo's constant talk and all the urging to eat just one more cake. Every day he looked for more signs that the snow was going away. Perhaps it would never go away, he thought gloomily one night as he lay on his pallet. Perhaps Wingo was only deceiving him, saying the snow and cold would end. Perhaps from now on this was all there would ever be. He resolved suddenly to leave this very night, to get up in the gleam of the fire and dress as he had planned to do, wrap himself as warmly as possible, take the pile of food that was always on the table in case Wingo should feel hungry in the night, and slip away to the mountain's rim and back to Norna's house. Wingo snored on. Quietly, Diller stood up, put on all the clothes he possessed. He went over to the table and filled his cap with food, since his head and neck were now covered with a warm woolen scarf that Wingo had given him. On tiptoe, he walked over to the fire, looked once around the cheerful room, and wished it would be possible to say goodbye to Wingo. Then he moved to the door of the cave. He put out his hand and touched the door, which he had never opened himself in all the time he'd been there. He did not even tug on the latch to know that it was useless. The door was too heavy and too firmly wedged into the rock for him to budge. He was a prisoner, as firmly locked inside the cave as he would have been in the iron-barred cage. That is the end of our chapter, and next time we're going on to chapter 10. Will he ever get to leave Wingo? If you like Journey Outside, you may want to try one of these books: City of Ember, The Giver, Ferals, Tomorrow Girls, Everland, and then we have 3 graphic novels on the same subject: City of Ember, 5 Worlds, Milo's World.